everybody. This is Stephen Louie, and we have another edition of the GrowerIQ podcast for you. Today we have Mike McAnlis from Native Roots on the show. Hey, how are you doing, Mike?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Not too bad. Mike is one of the lead growers at Native Roots. Mike, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the operation at Native Roots?
Yeah. So I grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. Just really wanted to explore the marijuana industry. So I moved out to Colorado in 2015, was hired with Native pretty much right off the bat, started kind of in the lower ranks and just worked my way up through the ranks of the grow, and now I'm one of the head growers.
Nice. And did you have background in cannabis before that?
Or horticulture? A little bit here and there, but nothing formal.
Gotcha. And then what year did you join Native Roots?
I started in August of 2015.
Of 2015. And at what position did you start?
I started on what's called our transition team, which is really the entry-level team in our grow. They do a lot of cleaning, transplanting, harvesting, just kind of miscellaneous grow-related tasks, but not directly affecting living plants.
Okay, gotcha. And now you've worked your way up to one of the lead growers, is that right?
Correct, yeah. My title is head grower.
Head grower. And can you tell us a little bit about the operation at Native Roots? What kind of grow methodology, the genetics, etc.?
Our large facility probably has 70,000 plants. We grow in cocoa. Wow. We use in-house made synthetic nutrients. We grow about 50 cultivars in like a large production scale. And then we have some smaller scale things where we're testing out new genetics to try and keep things refreshed and current. Gotcha.
Well, and talking about current, how are you guys staying up to date with new information on cannabis and new growing SOPs, etc.? Or are you developing those yourselves?
I think for the most part, we're developing ourselves. I think pretty much anything you find, like you need to try and make sure that it works for you in your space. So we might hear tidbits of, hey, what if we try this? And then, we always kind of keep like a small portion of the grow, like maybe 5% that's for R&D and just trying new things, and so let's do some trials here and let's try to eliminate it down to just one variable trial. And, what does this change? How does that affect yield, potency, terpenes, and, your overall outcome?
Right. And have you had any interesting successes out of that, or even interesting failures out of that?
I can't think of any like profound failures. Sometimes you might think that you're going to see an outcome and then you realize that maybe it wasn't worth it. Right. One thing that I noticed, I started doing a mid-bloom flush just to kind of like reset the salts that are in the pot. And, I actually found that to be very helpful. There was a section of plants where I had two strains, one section that did not get that flush and one section that did get the flush. And across both strains, saw about a 10% yield increase. I saw a slight potency increase and a slight terpene increase.
Wow.
So it was pretty interesting. That flush is just really just kind of hitting the media with a high volume of a very low strength feed. And, it was interesting to see that just what happens this one day has such a profound impact on the outcome.
Yeah. And so you've been getting consistent results, improvements with doing that mid-bloom flush?
Yeah. I didn't really found any areas where it's been detrimental. Some strains seem to take to it better than others, so some you're going to get, kind of a larger beneficial reaction, but I haven't found anything where it's like impacted negatively.
So, but across the board, it's improved things, no matter the genetics or
yeah,
whatnot.
Pretty much.
Yeah, that's amazing. And what sort of clued you into trying that?
Really, it's just following the EC of the pot. We have an EC meter, that's electroconductivity, which is a measure of the salts that are in the pot. And realizing that around like week 3 of bloom, it was kind of getting to the higher range of what I wanted it to be. And so I figured, okay, what if I give it a really low feed, kind of flush a lot of that immobilized salts out and just kind of allow things to build back up from there? And was then actually surprised with, how beneficial it was.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And then once you figured that out, is that now standard SOP across the entire grow?
Right. So normally I'll try stuff on a very small scale first. If it works there, I'll do it a little bit bigger. If it works there, maybe a little bit bigger. And if it continues to show, the same improvement through all trials, then I'll make it a new SOP.
Okay, very cool, very cool. And so over the years, I guess you've developed a few of these new SOPs.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. And then, so was this need to experiment yourself born out of like dissatisfaction for what grow information is out there? For tomatoes, I mean, they've been studied from here to infinity and back. And, to grow a tomato, there's probably a very, very thick training manual, but for cannabis, not so much.
Right.
And so have you been able to find quality information, or was this experimentation sort of born out of the need for it?
I think the experimentation was born out of just a desire to keep improving, and also just to keep things from getting stagnant. I think that if you just keep repeating the same thing over and over again, it's kind of easy to get checked out. So I like to do experiments just for that sake, just to keep things interesting. But also I think that, the more new methods of things that you try, like the more you're going to find, hey, this works, or hey, this doesn't work. And like you said, like, cannabis is a pretty new industry. So there's not a whole, there's not a whole lot of reliable information that has existed for a long time. And I think that, we're kind of discovering that alongside everybody else in the industry. I know since we grow in cocoa, like one thing that was said a long time ago is you can't overwater cocoa. I get a lot of people that come into the grow and like kind of think that, but at least personally, I found that not to be true. Like we can definitely overwater it.
Yeah, tell us about that. So people, I guess, are thinking that the cocoa there's a point of saturation, and that's way below. That saturation doesn't knock out completely all the air that's in the root system, but I guess that's not true, or at least that water flows and can to dissipate. But I guess that's not true.
Yeah, I think that the cocoa itself, is only going to hold on to so much moisture, but I think the space that's in between, little molecules of cocoa that is important. If that space has enough oxygen, then your plant's going to do well. If that space is just totally saturated with water and your roots can't get enough oxygen, you're going to start getting negative things that start building up in the pot. Different root rot fungus like Pythium or Fusarium or some anaerobic bacteria or something.
And then, so how do you guys guard against overwatering cocoa? Like, it sounds like you found out that it's possible. So how do you guard against stopping that?
Well, so we use an automated irrigation system, but I still have my employees go through and like kind of check each plant every day, like kind of lift the pot, make sure it's not too saturated. If it is too saturated, then pull the emitter and allow that plant to work through what it already has before you just keep dumping water on it.
Right. So that's a bit of a manual process, but you maintain it every day, I guess.
Yeah, it's
right. And how did you guys come to decide to do cocoa and hydronewts?
I think that in the beginning, it starts with, a lot of people think that you're going to get a little bit faster growth out of hydro than you are out of soil. So I imagine that that's where it started with our initial head growers. And I think that we kind of landed on cocoa instead of a fully automated hydro system, just kind of as a safeguard. Like I said, we have a very large facility and there's like 70,000 plants. So, it takes a tremendous amount of power to keep all systems running, and if in the event of a power outage, if you have a hydro system that's dependent on getting water, like every couple hours, and you have a power outage that's several hours long, like your plants are going to be in trouble. The benefit of cocoa being, you can kind of give it the amount of water that it needs for a day or, more if you need to. And, if that power does go out, like, well, it's a bummer they're not going to get light, but at least they're not going to wilt to death.
Right. So cocoa, you're saying more stable than a straight up hydro situation?
I think so.
Yeah, and I think most people would agree with that. And how did you guys, what informs the selection of the cultivars that you guys are growing?
I think that there's a couple different categories that, each cultivar kind of needs to hit. It seems like what drives the sales in the market is potency. So if stuff's not, over a certain potency, it doesn't really matter how well it grows if you're not going to be able to sell it. So that's one. For me, and I would think a lot of other people, smell is pretty important. So, we want stuff that kind of has like a unique terpene profile, or at least a pleasant one. And then, it kind of has to fit into our grow cycle. We have a 8-week cycle in bloom, so if it's something that needs 12 weeks to mature, then it doesn't really do anything for us. So it kind of has to fit into the program. And then yield too. We're not strictly focused on yield, but I mean, you can have like the best plant in the world, but if it hardly yields anything, like it's going to make it very hard to be profitable.
Yeah, it makes the economics really tough.
Right.
Yeah. And so do you, with those genetics, are you guys also breeding your own strains?
We do not breed our own strains. We have kind of a network of people that we can reach out to for new genetics. We're developing a seed project right now to, do some pheno hunting to find new strains.
Oh, tell us about the seed project.
The idea being that, we'll talk to a breeder, we'll get, several seeds, and we'll pop, a whole number of seeds of one strain, and, just kind of search for the traits within that strain that we want. Which one of those phenotypes is the most potent, which one has the best yield, which one has the best smell, and we'll do a few different pheno hunts alongside each other at a time, normally a handful of strains at a time.
Gotcha. But not you guys doing it. You've outsourced this to somebody else?
This is something that we'll do in-house, but we're not actually breeding the strains. We'll reach out to a breeder to get seeds, and then we'll pop the seeds ourselves.
Oh, I see. Gotcha. This podcast is brought to you by GrowerIQ, a compliant cannabis seed-to-sale and cultivation management platform. The first platform to integrate all facility systems like sensors, controls, QMS, and ERP, all into a single interface. GrowerIQ changes the way cultivators use software, transforming a regulatory requirement into a platform to learn, analyze, and improve performance. Very cool. So that's really interesting about the grow. I wanted to ask you too, a very popular question right now. COVID's come along. How has that changed your ops in the last 8 months and made things different for you?
Well, at first, I think it was pretty unclear, what the pandemic was going to do to the market. I know, at least here in Colorado, like on day one, when they went to the stay-at-home order, they said that dispensaries were going to close. They said the liquor stores were going to close too.
Oh.
And that lasted a total of maybe 8 hours. And then they stepped back and they were like, okay, this is going to be, an essential business.
Right.
But we did have to kind of trim costs, and, that entailed automating a few more things so that we didn't rely as heavily on labor.
Gotcha.
Which, kind of also helps being able to spread out and run the garden in a socially distant fashion.
Was that a pain to transition to?
Yeah, I don't know if pain is the right word. It was definitely an adjustment. So
Right.
one of the big things was that transition team, which is that, kind of auxiliary team that I was initially hired onto, got
Right.
eliminated, and a lot more of that work just kind of fell to the growers. We used to grow in larger pots, and we used to do a couple transplants throughout the process. Now we're growing in these cocoa cubes, which it's just a small, like 6x6 cube that the plant can stay in its whole life, and you just hook it up with an automatic irrigation system, and you lose a little bit of that safeguard that we had talked about, with the larger pot and being able to water it heavily. But,
Right.
as far as automation goes, like, it was, kind of a necessary step that we had to take. And so far it's worked out well.
And so that's just a step towards efficiency. Do you think you're going to keep those changes then, or will you rehire those teams?
I think it will probably stick with the changes.
Yeah, that just makes more business sense. Unfortunate for the teams though. And now that you guys are back open along with the dispensaries, have you guys noticed a change in sales?
I think that there was an initial dip, probably in like March or April, but to the best of my knowledge, like, sales are doing as well as they ever have. And I think it just kind of proves that cannabis, is recession proof.
Huh. Yeah, no kidding.
People are always going to need some sort of escape from, especially like such a bleak reality that 2020 has been for a lot of people.
Yeah. And with your entertainment and sort of options limited, there's not a whole heck of a lot to do. People are nesting, I guess. And that's one of the things you do when you nest.
Yeah, definitely. That was one thing that I always said. Like, I don't think that cannabis makes you lazy, but I do think it makes you okay with being bored.
Yeah. It's interesting. I actually saw a post about that this morning. Yeah, I definitely would agree with that. Did you have to change any of your SOPs or infrastructure in terms of like keeping things clean in terms of COVID, or were those already in place because
not really? I mean,
you're already on guard for that.
Yeah, like, I think that we were already trying to keep everything as clean as possible.
Right.
The big grow is there's probably 250 people that work in that building. So having a janitorial staff, having to keep things clean, was already important. Yeah, I'm sure that they started, sanitizing doorknobs more.
Right,
but,
right.
Like, large changes, I don't really think so.
But small spot things like that you may not have done before.
Yeah, and I guess, like, the one change that, like, I had made was just kind of spreading teams out. So, like, in a post-harvest area where previously you'd have, half a dozen people just kind of working all alongside each other, just kind of change that so that they could at least be 6 feet apart, and we could be conscious of social distancing and doing our best to slow the spread of the virus.
So are your trim teams now just really spread apart?
Yeah, I think that we've done that wherever possible, kind of spread things into different rooms and maybe taking up a little more space than we were doing before. But, I think it's all just being conscious of trying to slow the spread of the virus, doing our part.
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah. One thing I need to ask you about is grow software. So this is a GrowerIQ podcast. Wondering what kind of grow software you're using right now, and what you like and what you don't like about it.
So we have
or maybe software in general.
Right. We have a building management system that was developed for us by a local company out of Denver that, controls irrigation, controls CO2 levels, temperature and humidity, just kind of like the main automated parts of the building. And I think it does a good job for the most part. There's probably improvements in any system that could be made.
Right.
But I think when you're looking at, any sort of like software like that that's going to run your facility, I think for me, like having versatility built into it is pretty key. You might
tell me about the versatility.
Well, I just think it's a bad idea to get so locked into doing things one way that, it just becomes like a logistical nightmare to try and change anything. But like already kind of having a versatile software that can adapt as your procedures adapt, I think is pretty key.
Right. So you mentioned that software is controlling the environment and stuff like that. What are you using for inventory and track and trace?
As far as like plant inventory, we have to go through Metric, which is a state regulated thing, and that's like regulated by the MED. That's the seed to sale system that exists in Colorado and in a lot of other states. But we also have an ERP set up through Microsoft Dynamics that kind of helps control like supply inventory and, different things like that. Just streamlines everything where all the data is kind of held in one spot.
Right. Oh, that's good. And then, so I guess all these pieces of software integrate to each other and talk to each other.
Right.
So what are your biggest headaches at the grow?
As far as like IPM goes, like occasionally we'll see powdery mildew. And I think that's something that's very prevalent throughout the industry in Colorado and probably a lot of other places too.
Right.
We don't really see them here, but I have a number of friends that work in the industry for other companies that have a hard time dealing with thrips or spider mites or root aphids. For us, like prevention is key. What pesticides you're allowed to use is pretty strictly regulated by the Department of Agriculture. And, it kind of seems like you get to a point where there's not a whole lot left on that approved list that will really help you eradicate a population of something that's already well established. So just being vigilant and doing your best to prevent, big outbreaks from happening is key. So for like powdery mildew, we'll use like some oxidizers like xylitol, which is peroxide and periacetic acid, or we'll use some beneficial bacteria sprays like Bacillus subtilis spray. And then like,
are you buying that or are you making those?
We're buying it. We did kind of do some experiments with making it in-house and just found it not to really be too much of a cost savings. And like when we were making it in-house, like, we would get, microbes from somebody and then just kind of brew it in-house and apply it as like a beneficial foliar spray.
And how come you guys stopped doing that?
I think it was just kind of easier to go out of the bottle, and it really wasn't. There wasn't a whole lot of cost savings by doing it in-house.
Right.
And the nice thing about getting something from a company that's bottling it is you're getting the same thing every time. They go through their own quality control to make sure that their product is what it says it's supposed to be every single time.
Right. And then they become pros at that process. And so why, bring in another process that you guys have to manage, right?
Yeah, exactly. Like
that might be
we're
the idea.
cannabis growers. We're not bacteria growers.
Yeah, exactly. One more thing I wanted to ask you about. So I've seen some of these RFID tags out there. And I was wondering how helpful that would be to a grow, especially a grow your size. So instead of the barcodes, you can RFID tag them, and then they just, if they pass a door, you can have a sensor there that can track and knows where the plants went. Is that something that's helpful to you?
Yeah, I definitely think that would be something helpful.
I guess you're using a lot of time scanning trees, plants.
Right. Yeah. So each one of the metric tags has a barcode, and it does have an RFID antenna in it.
Does it?
Yeah,
okay.
But we currently don't have something that's reading all those, But, something like you're describing, like, having an RFID scanner at every door and just following exactly where those tags go and having that automated, I think that'd be very beneficial.
Any other things like that would that you're hoping for or looking forward to bringing into the grow?
I
or maybe it's on a wish list.
I think that it's important to just kind of keep your eye on what technology is developing. Like it is an exploding industry, and just kind of seeing what new technology develops and what might be beneficial for you. I saw a program that was made by Luna that kind of uses these cameras that scan over the canopy every single day, multiple times a day, and it's kind of like a smart software and can develop as you develop, and you can kind of program it in specific ways, but it helps with scouting. Like might notice a plant that's wilting, or it might notice a plant that beginning to show signs of some sort of infestation, and then can send an alert to a grower who's in the area, like, hey, go check out this specific section of the room. So I think software like that, like, it's definitely going to play a big part in the future of the industry.
Yeah. The predictive analytics piece, I think, is really interesting. I was working with a group that they had sensors and did algos that calculated something called vapor pressure deficit. And that was one of the leading signs to tell you if a plant was going to get too moist or was too dry. And it could tell you much, much earlier on. And then so you can come and do your intervention earlier and potentially save the plant. So those things are really, really interesting. And all coming down the pike, if not out already.
Yeah, definitely.
Finally, Mike, are you headed to any of the conventions? Well, I guess we're not doing any conventions, but are you doing any of the online conventions? Like today is December 1st, and I think tomorrow or today is the first day for MJ BizCon 2020.
I personally don't attend very many of them, but there are definitely people within our company that are attending those.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I guess it's a big shift. Everybody's going to do it virtually instead of going to the actual convention. But
right.
Okay, well, that's awesome. Mike, thank you so much for the time and the information. We really appreciate you being here. And best of luck.
Yeah.
Hopefully we get to chat again.
It was a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for having me.